All right, everybody. So we're going to jump into mass media and the political agenda. The agenda might be the most important lens to look through when we're looking at media because we are looking at information that is being presented in such a fragmented way that it is essentially impossible to get all of the information from one source. And so I think perhaps the best approach is to understand the politics, to understand what the media is trying to do in shaping policy, what their motives may be, what their agenda may be. And when you understand that, you can pick and choose different sources and get as much information as you can. So I'm going to show a couple examples of some charts. So with this, there is bias in the charts as well. And so I'm going to show a few to kind of demonstrate this idea of no one source can really give you all of this. Allsides.com is a great way to look up not just online, or these are just online content, excuse me. And so what this is showing is just the things that you would find on the internet, none of, as far as like Fox News on TV or CNN broadcast, you would not see that. Associated Press, they're usually the ones that are breaking news, and even NPR, for example, they break their news usually after the Associated Press breaks it. So Associated Press, highly recommend. BBC from the British government, that's a bias potentially. They do perhaps provide better American news, but they are still an ally. That plays a role as well. And really what you want to stay away from is the far left and then the far right as far as getting your news. Opinions is a little bit different. When we're trying to get the just information, that's different. That's where you would go to Reuters instead of like the getting like your information from someone's opinion piece in the New York Times. So again, this is just online. Here's another chart, that shows broadcast, internet, and also radio, and a similar type of thing. And this is not just showing left and right, but also quality, at least how they define quality. You can see their methodology as well on the internet as well. Let's see. Let's go to the next one, actually. This one perhaps is the most accurate. I know this one has the most amount of funding, the Ad Fontes Media. So this is version 6.0. It is kind of complicated, but I think, you do see similar ideas, right? You still see AP at the top. You still see CNN to the left. You still see, even like Fox News to the right. This may be a little low. Even this is kind of a little bit high, but you can see just the difference, and things like skews left compares to hyper partisan compared to most extreme, and then even just the y-axis is the amount of opinion. All facts may be fabricated, right? Like the Inquirer, it's tabloids, Infowars, conspiracy theories, Palmer Report, not where you should be getting your news. I think I got one more. Okay. So this one just kind of just another way to look at this. So this Goldilocks kind of zone, like this is where you want to get a lot of your information. Now, it's not to say you shouldn't check, perhaps more to the right, like Wall Street Journal, but a couple of things. Be careful of the bias in the title. When people are, when the media makes these stories, they're wanting you to click on them. And so they're going to make it in the title maybe something that is misleading, perhaps. You also want to stay away from media as far as getting your news, not entertainment. Entertainment's different, with things like The Daily Show. Trevor Noah is going to insult politicians on both sides. That's not really an accurate portrayal of the news. You want it without that bias. So again, even like The Economist would be a good source. And then it's important that you have an understanding of the ideas. And what I love about the BBC, for example, is they really break down a lot of these ideas where it's easy to understand. And then this is something I found interesting too. If you block friends that disagree with you, you are not thinking critically. If you are just watching CNN because you agree with it, it's not challenging your thinking, and perhaps you should try other sources that may go against something that you don't agree with to challenge your thinking. And the other thing, too, is just understand that TV news, especially what we'll get into with this narrow casting of the news, it seems to be biased, and more so than like local news, for example. And then one last thing is I would really encourage you to check out minute to minute, month to month, weekly, a variety of sources. I know, although a little bit left, Politico does great analysis of events. The Wall Street Journal is where I get my information when it's more analysis into the economy. And so having all these different resources and understanding which is credible and which is not, I think is a really important thing. So as we get into this conversation about the media, it's also understanding that they have an agenda. They have things that they have prioritized, and chief among them is a profit, is making money. So a couple thoughts. Just kind of reiterate. Be careful of conspiracy theories. Think things like InfoWars. Just because a website has a .org does not mean that it is reputable. For example, MartinLutherKing.org is a white supremacist alternative history site. Very, very different than what you would expect from the title. And just be skeptical of all media. Okay, it's trying to get a full picture, and each piece of media may give you a puzzle piece, and you're trying to put it together. And in addition to the profits, they're trying to skew the media. So look at the fact that the New York Times released its expose on President Trump's taxes right before the election. That is because the New York Times is attempting to impact policy. And then with the American media, where are they getting the money from? And then also with international allegiances, maybe not necessarily like an American example, but when you talk about the BBC, okay, they are an ally, so that may be a potential bias if it's something in the Middle East. Whereas you look at Al Jazeera from Qatar, they may have different things to say about American behavior in the Middle East. And then as far as allegiances, right, like the BBC and for example, BuzzFeed is essentially synonymous with liberal and thought like that, and just even Fox News. We know it's more aligned with Republican values. And then even the ownership. What's interesting about media is that the owners tend to be very conservative, and yet the bias seems to be liberal too. And so the ownership can play a role. Who owns the actual media company? And then just a couple things, the power of images, and then we'll dive right in here. So in the top left, this is Flower Girl, and this was an ad that was released talking about things that could be just destroyed with nuclear weapons, commenting on the war on terror. And when you talk about George Bush in general, I mean, the media would essentially take every opportunity to jump on George Bush and criticize the job that George Bush was doing. And then when you talk about President Clinton, Clinton's impeachment actually gave out or uncovered sort of a dark part of our society, which is that people blamed Hillary Clinton instead of Bill Clinton for his indiscretion. But we look at the partisan component of the impeachment itself, and the media definitely plays a role in that as well. One of my favorites is with social media, right? And looking at memes and the power of memes in conveying information. Now, memes and also tweets, which I know are presented as memes, are difficult in getting news. Yes, they are hilarious. Yes, they do convey a certain bias, but they can be misleading. Oftentimes with tweets, that sarcastic or witty type of phrase that was said may be reductive, may not actually be conveying what is the truth, so to speak, right? And then just one more that I love, right? Handy guide for confused liberals. Red indicates the states where Trump is president, because regardless of how you feel about the president, he is our president. He is the American president. And so, I don't know, just kind of showing that, media comes in all forms, especially now. Okay, so over time, really what we start with media is we see so much more since FDR, and especially since the internet. And even when you talk about TVs, it really goes from print media to radio to TV to internet, and it really expands the amount of media that is covered, also the way it's covered. But with media, a general tool that is used by both politicians and by the press. So the New York Times could host a press conference with public officials. The Trump administration could also host its own press conference if they have information they want to get out. So it's kind of like a two-way street as far as the press conference. And it's a way for the media to cover information to give to the people, but also perhaps the politicians have information they want to get to the people. And so, again, when we think of media, it's like political parties, it's a linkage institution. It connects the people to the government. And so, this is a way the media connects, is through press conferences. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is really the one who started this idea, and with the fireside chats and things like that, trying to make a presence, being in the home, so to speak, of Americans. And so this was very effective as far as approval rating of FDR, similar to the way the TV has been used with other presidents. Another thing we see within the media, we don't see this as much anymore, but a big component of the media is investigative journalism. So I'll give you a couple examples of this too, but this is where you have an in-depth research of something. I suppose the tax returns could be a part of this. Exposing, things from the Biden family would also be a part of this. The biggest one we'll talk about is with Watergate, but with investigative journalism, it's really in-depth. And we don't really do that anymore because these exposés don't really make money, and so media conglomerates don't end up doing this as much. Okay. I'm sure this is not a surprise, but coverage of presidential candidates has become much less favorable, and this is on both sides. Neither candidate is necessarily being portrayed in a positive light. However, the less favorability could also come from omission as well. So some examples, specifically with the investigative journalism, you would oftentimes find it in print. So I'm going to go over a couple. I'm going to go over print media, broadcast, which is television, and then more of the internet and the narrowcasting that we see today. But when you think of print media is newspapers and magazines. And so what we would see originally with print media is especially with the turn of the century, like the early 1900s, this concept of yellow journalism really sensationalized. Yellow journalism today would be more like a tabloid. Yellow journalism is what got us in part involved in the Spanish-American War, is that the journalists, the media portrayed Spain as a threat, as a nation, an empire that invaded the United States, or at least sunk one of our ships, and this is enough reason to bring the public opinion. And so print media, as far as its accuracy and the way it's portrayed, has improved. But in a lot of ways, print media isn't as common. There is sort of a hierarchy. Washington Post and New York Times are considered to be the top of the pecking order, the most influential, so to speak. And a lot of this comes down to circulation, how many people get your newspapers and things like that. Really has gone down. Most people get their media, and if it was print media, if you're going to get the New York Times, you're likely not going to read a literal newspaper from the New York Times. You'll likely see it on your phone. So here's an example of some use of journalism, use of media in a way, and print media as a way to convince people, of the agenda. And this is showing a monk within Vietnam setting himself on fire in protest to the leader of Vietnam at this point, Ngo Dien Diem, who the United States put into power. And so this is the media's attempt to convince Americans that something needs to be done. And I'll show some other examples of that too. And I think just going back to, because I didn't mention it, as far as investigative journalism, I mean, the two major things you think of, Woodward and Bernstein, they were the ones who broke the lid off of the Watergate scandal. They were the ones who found the slush fund and the orders for the break-in and things like that. And then another thing as far as investigative journalism we see with the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers was military information that was very, very different than what the TV was covering. Walter Cronkite said, we're doing really well, even though they're showing all the casualties. Excuse me, but in actuality, what the military documents show is we're not doing that well. And so the media is misleading people, and the government is misleading people about how things are going. And basically, the New York Times tried to publish this, and the government said, no, you can't do this. This is a matter of national security, and free speech won out. They produced this, and this really turned the tide as far as the media turning the tide against Vietnam. The people did not want to fight in Vietnam because they found that the government was lying to them. The president was lying to them. And in many ways, investigative journalism has opened the eyes of the people to different government actions. Let's talk about the TV. So print media is magazines and newspaper. Broadcast media is television and radio. And so maybe we don't listen to much radio as much anymore, but especially we still have television broadcasts, and television is a little bit different. Originally, broadcast media is the 5 o'clock news or the 6 o'clock news. You don't have this 24-hour news cycle. Broadcast media is everyone sits down in their home during the 60s and 70s to watch Walter Cronkite update them about the Vietnam War. And everyone in America is essentially watching at the same time. And so when you talk about Vietnam, they say Vietnam is the first TV war because it really brought this war into people's homes. And so it's no surprise that there were many more protests because the media's ability to connect the people to the government and its actions in Vietnam had increased because of the technology. Okay. So a couple other examples related to Vietnam, right? Just the terror, so to speak, the impact it would have on civilians. You have Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali gets his title taken away from him, says he won't go fight in the Vietnam War. And then you also just have a lot of especially young college-age individuals talking about getting rid of the war in Vietnam. And so the media's role in this is the media chooses to cover these ideas. This is a picture that became very famous during the Tet Offensive in the Vietnam War. And again, going back to that narrative of showing that maybe the Vietnam War is not going as well as we thought it was, right? This picture is aptly named Napalm Girl, and you can see the effects of the war having and just how miserable these individuals, these children are. And so again, the media in a blatant attempt to try and show sort of how radical Vietnam is. Another example with protesting is these are students at Kent State University in Ohio, and the National Guard was called on and they fired at students. 4 students were shot dead at Kent State University. And so again, another part of the media portraying this, and perhaps by the media covering it, makes the movement bigger too. Okay. So continuing with broadcast media, a lot of what we look at with broadcast media compared to radio, people say you have a face for radio, kind of means that you're maybe not super good looking. But with the appearances, so much of politics today is about the appearance. And perhaps that started more with the Nixon and Kennedy debates, right? We talked about how Nixon didn't want to shave, so he had like the 5 o'clock shadow, didn't want to wear makeup, whereas Kennedy did. And so those that listened to the debate on the radio said that Nixon won, whereas people that watched the broadcast media actually said that Kennedy had won. And so the difference between radio and TV can have a factor because we just talk more about mannerisms and appearances all the time. And I know you guys know that's true too. Okay. Couple of images with the broadcast media. Shaping public opinion. The media has an agenda. Here, showing patriotism, showing the unification, so to speak, of American people after 9/11, right? It's a very powerful image. This one is also powerful in a very different way. This is the Abu Ghraib prisons in Iraq. And so American soldiers were exposed for torturing prisoners of war that would go against the Geneva Convention. And so the media serving sort of as a watchdog, right, as sort of a check on what other people are doing. This is another powerful image, too, when you show the images of dead soldiers coming back to America, the impact of things like the War on Terror. This can impact public opinion as well. And so what I'm saying is public opinion can be covered by the media, but oftentimes the media will give cues to the people and tell them how they should feel, and they will shape the public opinion perhaps more than just covering it. Taking out Saddam Hussein, okay, so when we talk about overall, the media was very much in favor of perhaps taking out Saddam Hussein, and then it waned, definitely covered it differently as the war on terror in Iraq went on. This is the image taken in the Situation Room when they found Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, and that body was disposed of in the ocean. So you can see, many familiar faces here. This one is sort of the genesis of the Black Lives Matter movement. I think this is what would like Trayvon Martin, but I think with social movements as well, and even Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, just getting the different types of protests and things like that, social movements will definitely be covered by the media. I think I just have a couple more. This is Obama at Sandy Hook. Obama requested that he could be in one of the classrooms, to write and modify his speech. So the media definitely capitalized on that, and perhaps Obama did this for, partly because of photo opportunity. And then with Trump, right, one of Trump's big photo opportunities to show, his law and order stance and sort of his opinion with the religious component as well. So this was not too long ago. And then one more from Trump. This is the Amy Coney Barrett nomination kickoff, so to speak. And so this is taken, in the middle of a pandemic, and perhaps the media, which is skewed a little left, is trying to portray sort of how the Republicans in the White House are handling the pandemic. So trying to make these different statements, and again, the media definitely has its own agenda. Okay. So is it totally unchecked? No, absolutely not. But really what we see with the government is it's not necessarily regulating accuracy of content. It's regulating content as far as inappropriate content, right? So for example, the FCC, they are the government agency that regulates what you can and cannot say on television and radio. That's why with HBO isn't regulated by the FCC, and that's why you can say bad words on HBO. Even things change over time. I remember when I was in high school, they only showed South Park at 10 p.m. or later, and now they show it 9 in the morning. And so as far as the content control, the media only is checked by the government insofar as it's related to monopolies, so making sure one company doesn't take over. They may not do very well with that, but also the content control. What are you saying? What are you projecting? Not accuracy, just inappropriate. Now, like I said, the FCC is trying to break up monopolies, trying to make sure that we don't have a monopoly within media, but what we do have is essentially a handful of chains. And a chain is a giant media conglomerate. And with these conglomerates, I'll show you a graphic in a moment, we see that most media is only controlled by a few people. And although it says independent in what they can report, media are totally dependent on advertising revenue. So if people don't tune in, if people don't click, they're not going to be able to be in business. And so what we see a lot of times is that the media will cover things not because it should be covered objectively. These are stories Americans need to hear, but also because they're trying to make profits. And that you would call a vested interest. So as far as being, weary of the media, they're trying to make money. So that definitely should play a role in how much credence you give the media, right? And so it's not just, by the way, it's not just broadcast media, TV and radio. It is also print media and also local media as well. So here's an example. Now, this is from 2011. I'm sure that this has been updated as well, but this is a chain, right? Disney, CBS, Time Warner, NBC, things like that. So let's take Disney, for example, okay? Disney owns ABC, and ABC owns ABC Family, ABC Entertainment, ABC News. Disney also owns ESPN, and then we have Disney Plus. So bringing in the streaming is a whole nother thing. And then you talk about CBS, right? One of the original, CBS and NBC were the original broadcast companies in the United States. But you can see Showtime is owned by CBS, Viacom, and Viacom has Comedy Central, Nickelodeon. And then you have the Ted Turner networks, right? So Turner is the creator of CNN, which we'll get into in a moment, but also TNT, TBS, Cartoon Network, Turner Classic Movies, all that good stuff. And then the CW is jointly owned by Time Warner and CBS. So why does this matter? Because when you're trying to consume media, when you're trying to consume different things, you should know where it's coming from. You should know the fact that there are billionaires who own these companies, and yet there's still a liberal bias, right? Okay, almost done here. So how has it changed? Because we've gone from you watch Walter Cronkite at 6 p.m. to learn about the Vietnam War to breaking news, check back in, breaking news, same story on CNN all day long, all day long. This is what you call narrowcasting. Broadcast, broad, right? We're going to cast a broad net. We're going to cover a wide array of issues, whereas narrowcasting, we're going to microscope. We're going to focus in, and we're going to find specifically what will people tune into on cable TV, Nielsen ratings, things of that nature, and what can we do as far as getting people to click on things on the internet. So narrowcasting is CNN. Liberal Democrats watch CNN, and if we can get them, if we can say things that they will agree with, they will not change the channel, and we will make more money. So narrowcasting is you are focusing not on the general news, but offering a topic that only the people in that demographic would care about, right? And so when you're talking about comparing these, yeah, they still are covering things, in a credible way, but with a slant, an intentional slant. CNN, that's for liberals. Fox News, that's for conservatives. MSNBC, that's also for liberals, and BBC America tends to be kind of liberal. So the only other thing I would say too with this is like another example, I suppose, of narrowcasting is something like C-SPAN. C-SPAN is like a live stream into the different government buildings, right? Like Congress. And whereas Facebook, right? Facebook, you can go into specific groups. You can join different Facebook groups. I suppose it would be the same with something like Reddit as well. Like you can join like, our conservative or something like that, right? So on the narrowcasting, right, when you have CNN or you turn on Fox News, the narrowcasting is reported by what you call talking heads, these pundits who are hosts of their show, right? And so I saw like a tweet that said, if Trump is not reelected, what will Rachel Maddow talk about, right? And so the 24 news cycle is not so much about we're going to cover like in a 1 hour type of thing, like everything that's covered. No, we're going to slowly but thoroughly, step by step by step, break an idea, break a story, and then break it down. We're going to analyze it all day long, and it's very, very repetitive. It's meant that you would not need to change the channel. So instead of this broadcasting, we're really going to more of this narrowcasting. Okay. And then the last thing is just, I know like in your textbook it talks about with talking heads is like the angle, right? It's meant to show and like where it's kind of your head is almost like leaning forward, so to speak. But talking heads, Hannity, these are good examples of just the people who are leading the analysis, so to speak. So a couple of graphics I think will help you guys understand this too. So for example, this is going into 2013. You can see that the number of people watching television has pretty much remained the same. But part of that is because it's gone from the 6 o'clock news to people watching 24-hour news. Like my grandma never changes the channel. It just is always on there. But you can see the decrease in newspapers, significant decrease in newspapers, and obviously a significant increase in internet. And I think that these are related. The less newspapers from the New York Times you purchase and the more people that look at it on their phone, that's going to play a big role. But also what we have is a lot of conservative pundits really go for the radio. And so there is an increase in radio overall with narrowcasting as well on the radio. Now, this is what we talk about as far as like mass appeal, right? So I think this first one was Pew Research. Yeah, this one's from The Economist. So it took 35 years until 25% of Americans use phones. But it only took 7 years for 25% of Americans to adopt the internet. So things are getting faster, is what this graphic shows, based on the way in which you are getting your media. This one also from Pew Research Center. So looking at millennials, right? So this would be my generation, right? So my generation is much more likely to look at Facebook than they are at local TV, like watching the local news. I mean, I don't know if that necessarily says me, perhaps like using like the internet, but not necessarily Facebook. Whereas baby boomers, it's a little bit of Facebook and then local TV. This may be a little bit higher now. But definitely local individuals watch a lot of local TV now. Okay, great. And then this last thing that I want to go over is just the role of the internet, because we've gone from the print media, broadcast media, and now even more like narrowcasting within the broadcast media. Now the impact of the internet. The internet has the potential to inform politicians. So when we talk about, the founding fathers like Jefferson afraid that the people would not be informed enough, the internet is something that could combat that. The internet is the ability to inform people, but sadly, most people are not informed, even though they have the ability to become more informed. So that's just kind of a general trend. But the nice thing about the internet too is that it's purposeful, right? You can, if you want to find something out, you can go and find more information about it. And so really it is an opportunity, easier to find than like a book. It's easier to find information and little pieces of information too. But as far as the internet goes, it does become harder and harder to figure out what would potentially be fake, what is misleading, and things like that. And so even like recently this has changed too. Facebook is stepping in when its role is to stay away. So Facebook stepping in, I think, is potentially a bias against conservative politics, whereas Twitter seems to have its own like policy. And while it does do a lot of like checks on the misleading content, it does seem to step in, so kind of helping liberal people, I suppose. Okay, great. So that's what I wanted to show you guys today. This is the 16.1 video, and then the next video we'll get into a little bit more of the specifics of the bias and how the actual agenda is shaped by the media. Here I wanted to just introduce it, talk a little bit about how you can deduce different sources, and then understanding the different forms and how they have changed over time.